Imagine plunging 12,500 feet down into the pitch-black ocean. The water is freezing, the pressure is just immense, and rising out of the gloom are the ghostly, rusted remains of the most famous ship in human history. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the cinematic, heartbreaking, and honestly just fascinating true story of the RMS Titanic. We're going to strip away all those Hollywood myths and use real historical data, deep sea scans, and actual survivor accounts to understand exactly what went down. All right, let's jump right in.
Down here in the deep abyss of the North Atlantic, what you're looking at isn't some perfectly preserved time capsule. No, it's a decaying wreck that's literally being eaten alive by the sea right as we speak. But, how did this ultimate symbol of human progress end up crushed in the dark in the first place? To really get a grip on its tragic demise, we actually have to go all the way back to the beginning.
Act 1. The Unsinkable Dream. We need to rewind to the early 1900s, an era totally defined by immense confidence, rapid technological leaps, and just unparalleled scale.
The sheer magnitude of this undertaking was completely unprecedented. Picture this. Over at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, 14,000 workers labored for almost 3 solid years. They were risking their lives working at the height of a 20-story building just to construct this absolute marvel. The Titanic was a true engineering titan, driven by these massive propellers, and it stretched nearly the length of 3 entire soccer fields. Powered by 159 coal-burning furnaces, it was designed to be the ultimate express train of the ocean. And, well, with that immense size came an unbelievable amount of hubris. Before the ship even hit the water, magazines were already hyping it up as practically unsinkable. There's this quote that just perfectly captures the vibe. When passenger Mrs. Albert Caldwell actually asked a deckhand about the ship's safety, he looked right at her and said, "God himself couldn't sink this ship." And the thing is, this wasn't just some cheap marketing gimmick. The crew, the builders, the public, they genuinely believed that the ship's 16 electrically sealed watertight compartments made her virtually invincible. But here's the thing. This cutting-edge design had a critical, fatal flaw. Yeah, it had advanced watertight doors, and sure, it was designed to float even if 4 of those forward compartments were completely flooded. But the absolutely crucial point is this. The watertight bulkheads, basically the inner walls separating these compartments, they only reached up to E-deck. That's just a story or two above the waterline. They didn't go all the way up to the ceiling. So if the ship pitched forward, water could just spill right over the top of one bulkhead and pour into the next, literally exactly like an overflowing ice cube tray.
Act 2, the thriller. This hidden, fatal flaw was about to be put to the ultimate test on the moonless, glassy night of April 14th, 1912.
The disaster escalated with terrifying speed. At 11:39 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet spots this massive blue iceberg directly in their path. Just 1 minute later, 11:40 p.m., the fatal collision happens. And it wasn't some huge head-on crash, but rather a devastating 10-second scrape along the starboard side. By midnight, distress signals are blazing out into the dark. In a horrifying 2-hour and 40-minute countdown, the world's greatest ship went from a jarring little bump to total catastrophe, culminating in its final plunge at 2:20 a.m. In those final moments, the terrifying physics of the sinking just completely took over. As those 6 forward compartments flooded, the ship was pulled down heavily by the head. The stern, the back of the ship, shot way up into the air at almost a 45-degree angle. Just imagine the sheer weight of those massive steel propellers suspended up in the night sky. The ship's midsection simply couldn't handle that kind of unimaginable stress. At 2:18 a.m., with a screech of tearing metal that echoed through the freezing air, the ship violently snapped in half. And as the ship died, a devastating mathematical reality set in. 20 lifeboats, over 2,200 people on board. Originally, the ship's designer actually planned for 48 lifeboats, but they knocked that number down to 20 for aesthetic reasons. Yeah, just so the deck wouldn't look too crowded for the elite passengers. This meant there was literally only enough room for about 1/3 of the souls on board. And to make a horrific situation even worse, because of a total lack of crew training and just pure panic, a lot of those lifeboats launched only half full. Act 3, the heartbreak and the truth. While the RMS Carpathia bravely charged through some incredibly dangerous ice fields to rescue the 705 survivors, a thick fog of myths quickly began to surround the tragedy. So let's start busting some of these persistent zombie myths, starting with exactly how the ship went down.
Because of the early official inquiries, the public, and honestly a lot of historians, largely bought into the Hollywood myth that the ship sank elegantly in one clean piece. Some survivors swore it broke apart, but they were mostly ignored. It actually wasn't until Robert Ballard discovered the wreck in 1985 that the truth was fully confirmed. The ship was horrifically and violently ripped in two by opposite forces, shredding the metal hull as it went down. Okay, what about the famous missing binoculars in the crow's nest? The reality is, on a pitch-black, moonless night with a totally glassy sea that produced zero whitecaps against the ice, binoculars really wouldn't have given them the warning they needed anyway. Furthermore, the Iceberg didn't carve one massive cinematic gash into the side of the ship. Modern scans reveal it was actually a 300-foot series of tiny microfractures. But it was just enough to pop the rivets and let water steadily seep into those 6 compartments, ultimately sealing the ship's feet. And just to be absolutely clear here, there was no raging coal fire that doomed the hull. Yes, a smoldering bunker fire did exist, which actually, scratch that, was pretty common back then, but it absolutely did not compromise the ship's structural integrity. Nor were they recklessly trying to set some transatlantic speed record. They were simply maintaining a standard express schedule. The tragedy wasn't just one crazy mistake. It was a complex Swiss cheese model of failures aligning perfectly at the worst possible time.
Act 4, the dying wreckage. Let's leave the myths behind now and return to the eerie reality down at the bottom of the North Atlantic today. When the ship tore in half, the two pieces suffered very, very different fates. The bow, which was already filled with water, glided down somewhat gently, keeping its recognizable shape. But the stern? Completely different story. It plunged violently. As it sank, massive storage spaces inside the stern still held these pockets of trapped air. The immense deep-sea water pressure literally crushed these air pockets, causing the stern to violently implode on its way down to the bottom. That's why today, it's just this mangled, unrecognizable twist of metal. But what's truly mind-blowing is that the wreck we see today won't actually be there forever. In fact, it's vanishing. Deep down in the extreme pressure of the ocean, a unique iron-eating bacteria, aptly named Halomonas titanici, is actively devouring the ship. They create these fragile, icicle-like structures called rusticles. Every single day, these microscopic creatures are removing hundreds of kilograms of solid iron, turning that massive steel structure into fragile dust. Structural collapse of those legendary decks isn't just possible, it is actively happening right now. So the crucial point we have to face is this. The physical ship will eventually be entirely erased from the ocean floor. It might take a few more decades, but it will inevitably be flattened into a mere stain of rust and scattered artifacts. That's exactly why scientists and historians are currently in a total race against time, using deep-sea robots to capture high-resolution digital 3D scans of the wreckage before these microbes finish their meal. Which leaves us with a pretty profound question as we wrap up this explainer. As the Titanic slowly vanishes into the dark, freezing abyss, what actually happens to our collective memory once the physical ship completely dissolves? How are we going to preserve the truth of this magnificent tragedy when the ocean finally, completely reclaims its ghost? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep seeking the truth behind the history.